We had an opportunity during a sabbatical that we took during most of 2005 to spend most of one fall season simply traveling from place to place, going to as many worship services as we could go to, studying the way that churches in different traditions worship. And we were particularly expecting that we would find a lot of inspiration from the evangelical megachurches, which we did visit. But we were surprised to find that there were mainline Protestant churches and emergent churches, small congregations that were coming out of the evangelical tradition, still very conservative Christian, but that were adopting many different vital forms of worship practices that we thought could inform Unitarian Universalism. So out of that experience, my co-minister and wife and I, Kathleen Rollens, have written a book that is being published by Skinner House in 2007 called In Search of Transformative Worship. That's the working title. Well, our goal on the sabbatical was to visit as many congregations as we could in an intensive 3-month period, and then to bookend that with some very particular visits for churches that we were excited about seeing, both before and after the sabbatical. Our intention was to visit about 2/3 of churches of other traditions and about 1/3 Unitarian Universalist. And so what we did is drove around the country in several segments, and we did East Coast, Midwest, South, Minnesota, and West Coast, and visited altogether, including interviews that we did with church leaders. We touched the worship lives of about 40 congregations in about a year and a half to try to understand where transformative worship was happening.
And how much did you find of that in your churches? And
well, some. We have a rich tradition of flexibility and innovation in worship, and so we didn't want to discount that. However, what we did find is that very few Unitarian Universalists have really picked up on the possibilities for both newer technology in worship and for the rich traditions of musical diversity which are informing worship in other traditions. And this ranges from both the evangelical traditions that have adopted the power, praise, pop model of worship, and mainline churches and evangelical churches that have a lot more richness and complexity and diversity in their musical traditions that they are using compared to what Unitarian Universalists are doing. Well, what we've learned at this conference and what we've learned from the studies is that churches that are using more musical diversity and enriching their worship life and really focusing on their worship life as a key to growth are in fact the growing churches. Churches that are convinced that their particular worship model that they've always had is a model that is intrinsic to their identity and that is sort of part of who they are, that shouldn't change, and that don't have the flexibility to look at other possibilities, are staying stagnant or are declining. And I'm afraid that that's the circumstance that many Unitarian Universalist churches are in when it comes to their worship lives.
I've heard some people say it's because we haven't got a creed we can hang on to, so we hang on to the worship style.
Well, that's a good observation, that because the creed isn't central, because certain markers of our identity are very important to us. But we don't have to let go of some of those markers of our identity as a worshiping community, like the chalice lighting, or even like Joys and Concerns, to have a richer worship life that is adopting and sort of retraditioning for us some of the things that are helping evangelical churches grow. So I think for me the issue is not either adopt a contemporary worship model or stay the same. It's not do we just electrify our music and abandon classical music. It's nothing like those polarities. It's do we recognize that the theological diversity that is a hallmark of our churches needs to be expanded to recognize that a diversity of worship forms and styles is something that we can adopt and use in churches of all sizes. So that's what we've been advocating in the work we've been doing.
Is music the only issue?
No, not at all. In fact, I think one of the things that we sometimes make a mistake in thinking about contemporary worship is that it is music-driven worship to the point where the music overwhelms everything else. We were most interested in our travels in some of the emergent church worship, which has usually been led by people who grew up in evangelical churches, who have been used to this power pop, 3 big loud praise songs, a prayer, video, and a 40-minute sermon. That's the worship life they've grown up with, and they've been abandoning that for rediscovering worship traditions from the Christian tradition that they never knew existed because they didn't grow up with it. So we found that there was a lot of liturgical richness in emergent churches, a lot of adaptation of older liturgical forms, which we certainly can do. We're very good at that. Unitarian Universalists have been looking at some of the ways that other people have worshiped in other parts of the world, and less or so in Christian tradition, and recognizing that they don't have to own, there doesn't have to be a theological brand name on those ways of worshiping.
Like what?
Well, for example, we saw churches that were using for communion, for example, stations around the church where people could go and do communion in different ways. They could receive it from the minister, or they could stand around as a family and feed each other communion, or they could do it privately at a devotional communion area, and this idea of stations in worship. That's actually something that we've seen in children's worship in Unitarian Universalism. There are possibilities for how we could do meditative and prayer times in our worship that offer people different kinds of opportunities for how they like to spend devotional time. But these are things that we haven't really started to see spread in our churches that we could use. We've seen body prayer being used in evangelical churches in a way that Unitarian Universalists, I'm sure, could easily explore, because of course there isn't a creed associated with the way that you move your body to express feelings of meditation or emotion or devotion. So I think that there's lots of richness in what the emergent churches are doing that we can take a good look at. Well, I think I would say that when our church members in all sizes of churches think about contemporary worship, they shouldn't necessarily just think of, we've got to dump all of the music that we like and have grown used to and go to a rock band. That's not really it. The issue is, first, quality and the attention and dedication that a church of any size gives to its worship life and to all aspects of it, and looking for quality, diversity, and integrity in the worship practices that we use, which we can draw from many different kinds of traditions. I think that we will speak to all generations and to all of the needs that are in our congregations if we focus on quality, diversity, and integrity in what we do.